In the frozen heart of a Montana winter, three young German shepherds, Titan Scout and Nova, hung helplessly in the icy wind bait for the predators lurking in the dark. Just when the night seemed ready to swallow them whole, the beam of a military Humvee cut through the trees, revealing a scene no one could walk away from. What happened next would forge an unbreakable bond between soldiers and the dogs they saved. But the true impact of that night would reach far beyond the forest. What could turn a rescue into a symbol of hope for an entire community? The mountains of Montana lay wrapped in a shroud of white, the peaks lost in a sky heavy with snow. A hush stretched across the ridgelines, so complete it seemed the world had stopped breathing. The forest floor was buried under a thick, uneven quilt of snow, and each pine bough sagged beneath its own private burden of ice. Somewhere far above, the sun existed, but it could not pierce the dense veil of clouds, leaving the land caught in a perpetual twilight. The air itself had weight, cold and metallic, pressing against skin and bone alike. This was Hollow Creek in the dead of winter, too remote for most maps, too unforgiving for the unprepared. Here the silence was not peaceful. It was a warning. It was the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand, whispering that something was watching, waiting. A lone figure trudged through the snow, his outline jagged against the smooth drifts. Harvey Stroud had lived in these woods longer than most folks in the nearest town cared to remember. Tall but stooped, his frame was roped with the wiry muscle of a man who worked with his hands, though age had carved deep lines into his weathered face. A beard once a deep rust had long since turned the gray of week-old ash, and tangled strands caught bits of wind-blown snow. His eyes, small, pale, and constantly in motion, gave the unsettling impression that he was searching for something only he could see. Years ago, he had run a dog training facility on the outskirts of Hollow Creek Stroud Kennels. At first, it had been just another business obedience classes boarding the occasional breeding contract. But rumors began to slip into town, like cold drafts through a cracked door. Dogs left out in the elements for days, injuries left untreated, shouts in the dead of night. Eventually, enough complaints reached the county that the place was shut down, the surviving animals sent to shelters far away. Harvey disappeared deeper into the forest, after that retreating to a run-down cabin with no neighbors within miles. The man was not alone this morning. Three young German shepherds padded in his wake, their paws sinking into the snow with each step. They were barely 6 months old, with the awkward grace of adolescence' long legs. They hadn't quite grown into paws, almost too big for their bodies. The largest was Titan, a sable-coated male whose fur shifted in shades of gray, black, and warm brown. His chest was broad, his frame already hinting at the muscular build that would one day be his. There was a faint scar above his left eyebrow, a pale line just visible through the fur, and he walked with a slight limp, a remnant of some earlier injury. His eyes, golden brown and unblinking, scanned the world with the kind of focus that made him seem older than he was. Scout, the smallest of the trio, was a black and tan male with the restless energy of a shadow that couldn't keep still. His ears twitched constantly, his gaze darting from branch to branch, snowbank to snowbank, as though every sound might demand an immediate response. His movements were quick, almost jittery, and he carried himself like he was always on the verge of making a decision: fight or flee. Nova, the only female, moved with a quiet elegance that made her seem out of place in this frozen wilderness. Her coat carried a reddish undertone, deepening to the color of polished mahogany when the light struck it just right. Her amber eyes were softer than the others, thoughtful in a way that felt deliberate. She walked near Titan, glancing toward him every so often, as if seeking his silent reassurance. To them, Harvey Stroud was a provider. He had given them scraps of raw meat and chunks of stale bread since they had appeared at his cabin weeks earlier, abandoned shivering in a battered cardboard box near the outskirts of town. They followed him now, with the blind trust only the very young could give their tales, occasionally lifting and cautious wagging. They didn't know what it meant when food came with a rope. The forest began to open into a clearing, ringed by towering pines, their trunks like pillars holding up the sky. Here the snow lay smooth and unbroken, a stage waiting for its scene. Harvey's boots crunched to a stop, the sound unnaturally loud in the otherwise muted world. He shrugged the strap of his pack off one shoulder, setting it down atop a half-buried stump. From within he pulled a thick slab of venison, the raw meat glistening darkly in the dim light. Blood still clung to its edges, and the scent hit the dogs instantly. Scout let out a high, eager whine. Nova's tongue darted out to lick her lips, her eyes locked on the prize. Titan stood still, nostrils flaring, but his ears remained forward, uncertain. Harvey smirked. Easy now, he muttered, his voice low and almost coaxing. He set the meat on a rusted metal tray, nailed to the stump, the smell bleeding into the air like a lure. Then he reached into the pack again and pulled out lengths of coarse hemp rope, frayed in places, stained in others. He crouched near Titan, his gloved hands moving with deceptive calm. Titan's tail wagged once in tentative greeting. In a motion so swift it broke the illusion of gentleness, Harvey looped the rope around Titan's front legs, threading it behind his shoulders and yanking it tight. The pup barked sharply, confusion flashing across his eyes. He tried to step back, but Harvey's knot was practiced unforgiving. Scout barked in alarm, shuffling backward through the snow, his paws slipping. Nova froze, her body trembling but unmoving. Harvey moved quickly, grabbing Scout by the scruff before the little dog could dart away. Another rope, another knot, the pup's panicked yelps cutting through the cold air like splintered glass. Nova was last. Harvey approached her slowly, the ropes dangling from one hand. She stared at him wide-eyed, a mix of fear and disbelief burning in her amber gaze. But she didn't bite, didn't run. She stood trembling as the rope bit into her fur. Within minutes, all three pups were bound and lifted. Harvey hoisted Titan first, looping the rope over a thick branch and pulling until the young shepherd's paws left the ground. Titan barked once sharply before the panic set in, legs kicking against empty air breath, puffing in frantic clouds. Scout was next, swinging slightly as Harvey secured the knot. His cries were high and piercing, his body twisting helplessly. Nova made no sound when she was lifted, but her ears pressed flat to her head, her tail tucked tight against her body. The ropes creaked above them as they swayed, their bodies trembling from cold and fear alike. Harvey stepped back, breathing hard, his eyes sweeping the tree line. The stillness of the clearing seemed to lean in toward him. Somewhere beyond, the first long, low howl rose from the northern ridge, a sound that rippled through the air like a shiver. "That'll bring them," Harvey said, to no one in particular. His tone carried a grim satisfaction, as though this had been the goal all along. He glanced once more at the helpless shapes dangling before him, then turned. His boots crunched against the snow as he walked back into the shadows between the trees, his figure folding into the forest until nothing remained but the memory of his presence. The wind shifted, whistling through the branches, carrying with it the scent of blood and fear. Titan twisted in the rope, his muscles straining, trying to place himself between Scout and whatever might come. Scout's legs jerked with every gust, his ears flicking wildly. Nova kept her head turned toward the darkening tree line, her gaze fixed on something unseen. The howl came again, closer this time, joined by another from farther off. The sound layered and stretched, threading through the trees until it seemed to come from all sides. The clearing dimmed as the light slipped away behind the ridges, and the snow, once merely cold, began to feel like ice seeping into bone. Above them, the ropes groaned softly, shifting against the branches. The three young shepherds swayed together, silent now, except for Scout's occasional whimper. The forest held its breath. The only movement was the lazy drift of new snowflakes catching in their fur, melting against their warm skin before vanishing. Far away, yet unmistakable, the chorus of wolves rose again, sharper, nearer, carrying the promise of teeth in the dark. In that moment, Hollow Creek seemed smaller, the forest tighter, and the night endless. The clearing, once empty, now marked by 3 swaying shapes, waited for what would come next. And in that waiting, the wolves closed in. The ropes spoke before the wolves did. They groaned in slow, aching syllables. Each time the wind pushed through the pines, a tired wooden language that scraped across the clearing and settled into fur and bone. Titan felt every fiber bite his chest, the twist of hemp grinding against skin, where the winter had already numbed sensation. Pain bloomed in a dull circle under the knot, then sharpened with each sway. He tried to breathe slow the way instinct and memory suggested, nose first, chest steady, but the cold stole rhythm and left him gulping white vapor. Below him, the snow waited like a quiet surface of water. Not far to his right swung Scout lighter and more frantic paws, scissoring for ground that never arrived. The young male's ears flicked between every sound, every flicker of movement, a living tuning fork in a forest of echoes. His breaths came in thin, choked bursts. His eyes kept flashing toward Titan, as if asking for a command he didn't know how to give. Nova hung slightly apart, a red burnished silhouette against the gray pines. She had chosen stillness when the ropes first tightened around her stillness, to think, stillness to hear. Her amber eyes tracked the dark between the trunks, the place where the nearer branches met shadows, and made something like a door. The wind combed her fur and found the warmth at her throat. It brought scents, metal, old wood, the sour trace of human sweat still clinging to bark. And beneath it, changing with each minute, the musk of wolves riding up from the gully's eddies of hunger braided with snow. Titan shifted his weight against the rope and translated fear into purpose. He twisted shoulders, burning, fighting the simple geometry of knot and branch to put his body between Scout and the dark door in the trees. The maneuver cost him air and balance. The rope cut deeper. The branch creaked. The effort carried his scent forward on the wind, a warning, a promise that whatever came would meet more than meat. Scout's frantic pawing slowed. The smaller dog stilled enough to listen, to breathe through his narrow chest. He took Titan's ferocity as a shelter and settled inside it. The forest listened too. The wolves' chorus thinned from a tattered ribbon of sound into single notes spaced by intent. Snow that had drifted lazily an hour ago began to angle in tighter lines. Between trunks, shapes rearranged. A low sweep of shadow, the pause of eyes reflecting a smear of sky, the weight of bodies that knew cold the way fish know current. The pack moved as a single thought divided by hunger. Up over the second ridge, something else moved with purpose. The Humvee's engine lived in the throat of the winter road, steady, patient, never hurried. Its low rumble climbed under crusted drifts and into root tunnels, rolled down frozen creek beds, and scattered a few lingering ravens off their black perches. Frost feathered the inside edge of the windshield glass until the defroster pushed it back in shrinking, uneven scallops. Snow hissed under the tires. Each time the big vehicle shouldered through a depression, a muffled thud traveled through the frame into boots and knees and ribs. Ethan Cole drove like a man who respected both the night and his machine. He kept the wheel with his left hand, and his jaw set, right palm resting on the stick, as if it were a living thing to be calmed. In the steel wash of the dash lights, the lines carved by deserts and cities, and too many basements where voices shook, looked deeper than they were. His eyes, storm gray receptive, watched the mirror more than most drivers did, not the rear view. The small, round, convex one he had attached to the inside of the windshield angled down to catch his own hands. If they started to tremble, he wanted to know first. Once on another continent, he had driven with a shepherd pressed against his thigh arrow, a heat and heartbeat that made combat math easier. That memory felt like holding a warm coin in a closed hand. It comforted and burned. Next to him, Marcus Dean rolled a nickel across his knuckles. It walked finger to finger, stopped, then reversed direction with a soft metallic tap. The coin had belonged to his grandfather, a man who taught him to fish catfish out of river eddies with quiet patience. Marcus's face, all edges softened by a deep steadiness, turned toward the side window and the wind-scratched night. His leg throbbed where an old injury kept its steady weather. But pain had become another current to read rather than a wall to push through. He had learned that in hurricanes and wreckage, in cities where water came up to the collarbones and dogs swam toward him with eyes that asked and asked. Pepper had clambered into his boat after one of those storms and turned a rented apartment into a home. Pepper's collar lay coiled in his footlocker now. He touched its ghost sometimes the way some men touched medals. Behind them, Noah Grant sat sideways on the bench seat, boots braced against the floor, curls matted slightly by a beanie he refused to give up even inside. He cradled a thermos between his palms and let steam warm the tip of his nose. His mouth moved occasionally, a habit of forming quiet words to no one in particular, as if narrating to a creature beside him. He was the youngest of the three and carried warmth like spare blankets. He offered it even when no one asked. Before enlisting, he had wanted to put his hands on dog bones and fix what was bent to listen with a stethoscope for the ways a heart could be convinced to continue. The war rerouted him. It hadn't erased the map. Static grazed the radio, then collected itself into a human voice. Copy repeat multiple howls south of Hollow Creek Line, locals requesting sweep. The transmission rattled, then solidified. Unusual range for this weather. Possible food scarcity pushing packs closer. Ethan lifted his eyes to Marcus. The coin stopped under Marcus's index finger. Noah set the thermos between his boots and leaned forward. South Ridge is that fence line past the old Ranger Spur, Noah said. The one with the bent ATV gate. Same gate, Marcus answered. 2 gullies there. Good cover. Ethan's hand stayed steady. We'll run the spur, keep it slow. If they're hungry, they'll be moving. If they're moving, we'll hear it. He didn't say what each man knew. Hunger rewrites rules. Wolves avoided the second ridge most winters. The cattle stayed to the west pastures. People rarely wandered beyond the logging road. The valley's winter had been longer, meaner this year. Frozen creek mouths looked like hammered steel. Pine nuts were scarce. Even the magpies had gone quiet. The Humvee angled off the county track and onto a narrower, older cut that remembered the weight of men on skis and horses more than engines. The snow rose, then packed down under the tires with the scaled, soft percussion of crushed shells. Branches leaned across in draped arches and tapped the roof as the vehicle shouldered through. Ethan let the engine drop to a lower rumble and matched it with slower breath. He listened. The winter had a grammar here. It spared words. A branch crack signaled more than weight direction distance, whether weight came with intention. The wind said where the colder pockets lay, how sound would carry through the next stretch. He could feel the road's edges through the wheel, through the little shivers that ran up metal and into his forearms. Got anything, Noah asked the night beyond the windshield, more than he asked Ethan. Marcus's coin moved again. Wolves don't sing for tourists. If they're close, they'll go silent. If they're far, they'll be chorus. As if responding to a rule spoken in a different language, sound combed the length of the valley. A low howl stepped into the space between trees and unfurled along the ridge like a banner. Another joined it farther left. The voice of a third braided underneath. Noah's head angled like a dog working out a scent from an updraft. That's a big male anchoring, he said. 2 subordinates answering. They're spread. Not a wander. They're pushing. Toward what Marcus asked, voice flat with purpose. Toward whatever smells like blood, Noah said softly. The road narrowed further and rose. The Humvee took the climb like a bear, slow committed, sure of its own weight. Ahead, through gaps in boughs, a gray-lit seam showed where a clearing might open. Ethan flicked the headlights down a notch to keep the beam from splintering the trees into jittery shadows. He knew animals watched light the way people watched hands, not for brightness, but for intention. Inside the clearing, Titan read the same grammar from a different page. The pack's song fell away, and in its place came the soft arithmetic of paws on crust, measured pauses, breath held and released in cautious increments. The alpha appeared first as a darkness that carried itself lower than shade, then as a body black-shouldered, ribbed with winter's story eyes, bright the way ice is bright when it catches a blade of morning. He stepped out past a thin spruce and sent a message back with a tilt of his jaw. The trees answered with shapes. A gray female in her prime steps, crisp and minimal. A yearling with one ear nicked. A broad male with a scatter of old scars on his flank. 5, 6, then 7. The number mattered, but not as much as the way they took up the space. They didn't rush. They took measure. Scout tried to shrink inside his own skin, hamstrung by rope and by the instinct that usually sent him underneath a log or into thick brush. He wheezed and swallowed it, then wheezed again. Titan angled his body and stole a thin strip of wind meant for Scout, sharing his own scent, older, steadier, threaded with defiance. Nova's eyes closed and opened, once slow. She drew in the air and sent something of herself outward. Not a sound, but a weight, a tension calm. A fragile flag planted on a patch of fear. The alpha's head lifted. He tasted the variables and understood that the meal hanging before him lived inside a perimeter of human. The rope stank of handled fiber. The blood's edge told of recent hands. The tracks near the stump carried a man's gait, the particular heel wear of boots that had spent years doing the same wrong things. The wolf didn't know the word cruelty. He knew pattern and consequence. He measured risk. From the south, wind squared itself and carried the smell of diesel and warm steel. The alpha's ears shifted. The pack redistributed its weight and weighted the extra heartbeat that separates wild hunger from wild wisdom. On the road, Ethan eased to a stop where the track narrowed to a throat. He killed the headlights and let the darkness settle like a blanket put back over a sleeping child. The engine idled low. The 3 men listened in a little country of their own breath. "Left draw," Marcus said, indicating with his chin. "Sounds coming up through there." "Clearings beyond," Noah added. "Old ranger stump. He used to hang salt there for elk. Smell would carry on a day like this." Ethan nodded once and rolled forward. The Humvee slipped past the bent ATV gate and found the old spur. Pine tips brushed the side windows and wrote a quick set of glyphs into the frost. The wolves drifted closer, silent now, spacing clean each step, a decision. The alpha edged inside the first ring of scent and felt the clearing's shape with the pads of his feet. He pictured how chase would play inside those perimeters. He saw that chase would not happen. The meat hung still and vulnerable. But inside geometry, the pack didn't like branches, tight escape lanes. Narrow scent of men all over the ground. Risk and reward argued. Hunger lifted its head again. Titan's ribcage worked. He took the wolf's presence into himself and did a simple, ancient thing. He made himself look bigger. Shoulders back, eyes bright with a heat that outshone his shiver. He held the alpha's gaze for 3 heartbeats. In that brief exchange, passed an economy of meaning. I am small, but I am fire. I am tethered, but I am not free for taking. The alpha blinked. Not submission, acknowledgement. Scout found a quiet inside Titan's posture and put his jaw there. His whine turned into a low hum of sound, that first awkward attempt at the deeper voice he would later use to ground frightened children and restive veterans. Nova tilted her head toward the gully and almost smiled the way dogs do when they taste snow and remember green springs. She was afraid, but she held both truths at once, fear and attention. She found room for both. The Humvee shouldered out of the trees and paused where the old road opened into a pocket of open snow. Ethan lifted the headlights without turning them on and let ambient skylight make its own poor illumination. He parked with the path of retreat already chosen, rear tires slightly angled to the exit, and breathed in through his nose. Diesel winter, the breath of men. And there a mineral edge of blood resin struck from bark, the ghost of meat. Underneath a musk that triggered a quiet prehistoric part of his brain. "Wolves," Noah said, voice barely sound. "They've committed to the approach." "Then we're right where we're supposed to be," Marcus replied. The radio cracked again this time, just a faint check-in from base control, and fell silent as if winter took it for itself. Ethan let his fingers rest on the key, killed the engine, and opened his door slowly, so the hinge wouldn't complain to the forest. The world expanded without the engine's thrum, revealing micro sounds held just beyond hearing the crisp break of a far twig, the small hiss of falling flakes landing on settled snow, the muted creak of wood that was not tree, but rope. Rope. All three men registered it at once, without words. Rope spoke of human intention. Rope meant something had been put where it did not belong. Marcus stepped out and set his boots with care. Noah slid down and closed his door with 2 fingers on the metal to guide it home. No slam, no clack. Their breath rose in 3 separate columns and drifted sideways in the same current. Ethan raised a hand palm low and moved forward along the edge of the trees. He cut his silhouette against trunks instead of sky, a habit built into the bones of men who have walked into fields where the horizon wants to hurt you. Marcus ghosted to his right, close enough to share breath if he needed to speak, but far enough that one man's slip wouldn't cascade into the other. Noah followed in their wake, lighter on his feet than his size suggested, eyes raking the snow for pattern rather than romance. He registered the tire tracks, half filled with drift, the heel-heavy print of a boot head with a worn edge, the lurch of small paw marks where running had turned to skidding and then to something else. They came to the edge of the clearing. Ethan stopped first. The world held both too little light and too much detail. The silhouettes of 3 young bodies hung from low branches in clean, merciless lines. The ropes that held them drew dark slashes against new snow. Their breath came in silvered bursts. Their eyes, when they found the movement at the tree line, changed the air between living things. Noah's mouth opened once and then closed. Marcus's coin lay cold in his fist. Ethan felt something old lift inside his chest, like a bird that had learned not to startle, now forced to rise anyway. Beyond the dogs, the forest rearranged itself again and offered 7 quiet shapes between the trunks. Eyes gathered what little light there was and gave it back as answers. 2 movements headed for the same point. In the dark, the pack shifted 1 pace closer as a body. Along the trees, 3 men moved forward in the language of rescue boots, finding the firmer, quieter parts of the snow. In the middle, the ropes gave a tired whisper. Nova watched the men and then the wolves and understood only the shape of intention. One shaped like teeth, one shaped like hands. The valley exhaled long and low as if making room. On one edge of the clearing, paw pads pressed a new line into powder. On the opposite edge, rubber soles cut 3 slow arcs. The paths curved toward each other like 2 halves of one decision. The clearing received them both. The night took attendance, and Hollow Creek, frozen listening, leaned forward. The alpha stepped out of the timber as if the trees had decided together to give him shape. He wore winter like a robe, black along the shoulders, frost caught in the ridge of his rough ribs, written under the pelt with lean calligraphy. His paws placed themselves with the economy of a creature that had measured distances its entire life. The pack poured up behind him in quiet pieces. A gray female with clean slicing strides, a scar-etched male, a yearling whose one nicked ear made him look perpetually curious. 2 shadows that could have been littermates, breathing in the same small rhythm. 7 lives, 1 intention. Titan felt the intention arrive before his eyes understood it. It traveled along the rope into his chest, a current braided with the scent of iron snow and old bark. He answered by lowering his head and thickening his stance even in the strangling geometry of the knot. A growl started where breath becomes voice and rose until it gathered gravel. It was not large. It was willing. Scout heard Titan's sound and swallowed his own panic. He found the growl's pitch like a tunnel and moved his breathing through it. Nova held herself composed and forward, the fine tremor in her shoulders smoothed by focus. The wolves respected stillness when it meant sense rather than surrender. The alpha drew within 20 paces and paused, eyes alive, with the kind of light that does not come from the sky. Headlights sliced across the clearing. They did not explode the dark. They parted it. The Humvee's high beams lifted and cut a white blade through the trunks, catching breath on snow crystals and turning the rope's catenary curves into stark black lines. For a moment, the world flattened into a terrible photograph. 3 young shepherds, suspended legs, pawing an emptiness that offered no answer. 7 wolves arranged like notes in a dangerous chord. 3 men at the tree-line, shoulders squared and faces set by training and grief. The alpha did not flee. His head turned toward the light, then past it, calculating whether light came with thunder and fire or with the small sounds of men. The pack spread 2 steps wider, redistributing risk. The geometry changed again. Ethan Cole lifted his free hand slightly, a signal that needed no words. Marcus Dean answered by angling right boots, setting in the quiet snow, with the weight of a man who knows precisely where his center lives. Noah Grant drifted left the curve of his body, making him look smaller than he was. The 3 of them, in that brief strip of time, became a shape the wolves recognized, firm, deliberate, unafraid, and unwilling to waste movement. "Distance?" Marcus asked, voice pitched low enough to belong to breath. 25 to the alpha, Ethan said. He didn't sound like he was making a guess. "Ropes are fresh," Noah added. "Fiber still holds warmth. Whoever tied those knots walked out of here on legs that won't go far in this cold." No one said what the scene already shouted. The dog's paws did not touch. The wolves would be patient for 1 more minute, maybe 2. After that, hunger would make a decision, and decisions had teeth. Ethan drew a line in his mind, from the nearest rope to his knife. He tested the sheath clasp with his thumb and felt the old scar under the leather. The little ridged reminder of a time his hand had been slower than pain. The dog closest to the stump Titan faced him, with eyes that were wide but steady, a leader's gaze trapped in a child's body. Arrow had worn that exact expression the night the alley took him. The memory lifted like a flock of birds and scattered across the sky of Ethan's awareness. He let it pass and kept his hands quiet. "On my count," Ethan said. "Marcus, take the small 1 left branch, shortest drop. Noah, the red female right. I've got the big one." Marcus nodded once, eyes flicking to Scout. Noah's jaw tightened, the way it did when he remembered exam rooms and euthanasia waivers and a life he had promised to live. He took a breath and felt it settle his shoulders. Ethan raised his hand. 3. The wolves moved a hair closer, an almost silent sliding of pads. 2. The ropes creaked as the wind pensively adjusted itself. 1. They broke from the tree line like runners who trusted their legs more than weather or fate. Snow surrendered under boots, flakes leapt. Cold air flashed knives into lungs. Ethan took the center path, knife already clear, body low, eyes never leaving Titan's. Marcus vectored left, angling his approach to come in under Scout's swing and catch him at the hip. Noah took the right arc, reading the rope as a problem with a single true answer. The alpha made the same decision at the same instant. He became forward motion, a dark comma thrown into the sentence of snow. The pack answered with a synchronized narrowing. Lines that had been cautious became purposeful. Hunger stepped from the shadow of restraint. Everything compressed. Ethan reached Titan first. He slid beneath the dog's arc and anchored his knee into the snow shoulder set against the trunk. "I see you," he said, voice a human bark that asked for trust. Without time to deserve it, Titan's growl broke on a whine of relief, only a note, only a heartbeat, and then steadied again. Ethan saw the knot, simple, tight bark burnished by the last vicious tug. He cut with a short, efficient motion blade traveling away from flesh toward the weight of wood. Fiber parted. Titan dropped like a sack of breath and muscle. Ethan had already folded an arm under the chest and a hand behind the head. The pup struck his forearm instead of the ground, huffing through pain and surprise. Ethan rolled, absorbing the drop with his own back, and came up on one knee, with Titan tucked against him, a football carry learned on a summer field repurposed for winter triage. "Good boy," he said, words low and steady as a drum. Titan's heart banged against Ethan's sleeve. The dog's eyes, still too bright, flared and then softened. The growl stayed alive. It pointed itself toward the pack. On the left, Marcus reached Scout and took a different angle. He didn't go for the knot first. He went for the sway. He set his shoulder against the trunk and let Scout brush his parka, with each pendulum, pass his hands timing the next arrival. "Hey," he said, voice pitched like he was speaking to a frightened child behind a bathroom door. "I'm right here." Scout swung. Marcus caught him behind the elbows with one forearm and cupped his rib cage with the other hand, taking the dog's weight into himself for the single moment it took to free the knife. He saw the knot, saw the fray, stitched with crystals, saw the twist that would pinch when cut. He sliced the top loop rather than the body a cleaner release a fall that would roll into his chest. The rope let go. Scout collapsed into Marcus's arms and kicked once, twice claws finding the fabric and not skin. Marcus absorbed it with a grunt, turned his shoulder into the wind, and tucked the small shepherd into the angle between ribs and bicep. The pup trembled against him. Marcus lowered his head and pressed his cheek to Scout's ear. Not a kiss, just a wait. "Easy," he said. We moved together. On the right, Noah came under Nova with all the motion of water finding a riverbed. He didn't speak at first. He let his hands tell her the math 1 on her sternum's far side to guard the fall, one set to guide the arc of her head away from the blade. He took a breath to steady his fingers. This had to be one cut clean and away from blood. And then he made it. The rope whispered itself into 2 pieces. Nova dropped. Noah was already there. Her body met his arms, her eyes met his face. Something inside both of them understood the other without translation. "You're safe," he said, finally giving the moment words. Nova licked his wrist once, a small, deliberate acknowledgement. The wolves did their own arithmetic. Their calculus said the meat now ran contained by men. The alpha adjusted the plan with the ease of a general. He angled to the left to test the edge where Marcus stood deeper in the open. The scarred male pinched the right, probing Noah's position. The gray female set herself toward the center eyes on Ethan and Titan, ready to disrupt their cohesion with a feint that would open a seam for the yearling. Ethan felt the shift and raised his sidearm without angling the barrel toward any living thing. He put a single round into the sky. The shot opened above the clearing like an iron flower and shook sound down through the trees. Snow jumped on branches. The yearling flinched and rethought the day. The alpha did not retreat. He recalculated. The pack slid back half a pace, not submission, a reserve of options. Hold, Ethan called a command meant for wolves as much as men. He moved backward in controlled steps, Titan against his chest, the weapon lowered again. Finger safe line of retreat mapped behind his heel. The clearing changed in long, slow exhale. That was when a human voice arrived, hoarse, ragged, carrying a burr of ego like broken glass. "Get away from them." The men pivoted toward the sound. A figure stumbled out of the timber on the far side, tall and gaunt, inside a frayed coat. In the weak spill of headlight, his face looked carved from old bone. He carried a rifle slung carelessly, the muzzle low, the strap biting his shoulder through the canvas like a long-standing argument. Bootsteps scuffed crimson into the surface of the snow, where a heel had cracked skin. Noah's stomach tightened of its own accord. Marcus felt Scout's tremor spike. Ethan adjusted his stance, keeping the pack in the corner of his eye. "Hands where I can see them," Ethan said, tone-level volume pared down to carry without threatening the pack. The man grinned without warmth. "Them ain't yours. Neither are they yours," Marcus answered, voice flat, the words falling into the snow with weight. "They're bait," the man said, as if delivering a line to a dull audience. His eyes flicked to the alpha with the proprietary pride of a trapper admiring his snare. "Wolves have been lazy. You give them a reason to earn dinner, they get strong again." The pack rayed the new arrival as one more risk to evaluate. Their eyes never lingered on him. Their noses did the work. The alpha's lip lifted a fraction. "Name," Ethan said. The man shifted his jaw, then spat a small halo of pink into the snow. "Pike," he said. "Walter Pike. Harvey Stroud's former shadow." The name clattered in Ethan's head with an ugly familiarity he could not place on a map, only in a catalog of people who do harm because harm makes them feel bigger than their own reflection. "You're going to put the rifle on the ground," Ethan said, tone neither hard nor soft, simply inevitable. Walter tilted his head. Or you're going to discover how fast a medic can tourniquet a stupid decision?" Noah said, the good humor gone from his voice. Walter's grin slipped away, like frost under a thumb. "You Marines are all the same muscle in where you don't belong. That trap is mine." He jabbed a chin at the ropes now dangling empty. "My rope, my meat, my wolves." Nova lifted her head in Noah's arms and set her eyes on Walter with the kind of ancient clarity only prey and the very brave carry. Scout tucked his head under Marcus's chin, then peeked out again, curiosity wrestling fear. Titan returned to his feet but pressed against Ethan's leg for balance, sent a low, steady growl across the clearing that turned the cold air into wires. "Last chance," Ethan said, not because he wanted Walter to comply, but because the rules of the world have to be said aloud for them to retain their shape. "Hands up. Rifle down." Walter rocked backward on his heels, then forward again, posture loose in the way of men who have loved violence for a long time. And then he ran. He pivoted and broke for the trees, boots scattering powder coat flapping like a wing that never had the strength to lift anything. Ethan did not fire. Marcus did not chase. Noah did not set Nova down in the snow. They didn't need to capture a name that would hang itself on the next thorn. Their mission lived within the small bodies pressed to their chests and legs, within the line between hunger and harm. The alpha watched the human bolt and dismissed him as irrelevant to the immediate equation. His gaze returned to the three men and the three dogs. The pack tested forward again, almost politely, as if asking whether the bargain had changed. Ethan shifted Titan behind his shin and took one even step backward. Marcus, moving in a low arc, began to angle Scout toward the Humvee's open door, which Noah had left unlatched, with the same foresight he applied to every room, every alley, every uncertain street. Noah slid his weight and Nova's together, feeling her heartbeat ease under his palms, even as the world tightened around them. The gray female advanced 3 paces and stopped. Her nose rode a bright line in the cold human steel dog pain rope fiber meat's distant edge, the lingering stink of the man who called himself Pike. She understood that the meal had shifted species. Wolves, for all the stories told about them, prefer the clean math of chase and fall. This was tangled. This smelled like a hole in the ground you cannot see, until you are in it. Ethan lifted the pistol again, not to point only to remind. He put a second round into the sky farther off, sending the echo down the valley like a shepherd dog, snapping air at a herd to turn it. The alpha made the tiniest decision, a shoulder angled a quarter inch to the left. The pack folded backward a single step in exquisite unison. "Go," Ethan said low to his men. "Slow." They went. The snow took their prints and agreed to erase them by morning. Marcus reached the Humvee first, planted a knee on the runner, and lifted Scout into the back seat onto a blanket Noah had dragged forward before they left base, a habit of carrying softness into hard places. Scout curled against it as if it had been spun for him alone. Marcus's hand lingered on the pup's spine for a breath, then withdrew to his sidearm. Noah came next, placing Nova onto the floor behind the driver's seat, where the heat from the vents would roll down and gather. He took 2 seconds exactly too, and rubbed her ears the way he would have in any warm kitchen. She closed her eyes as if the kitchen existed. He rose and turned to the clearing again. Ethan moved last Titan, walking under his protection. But on his own feet, now the dog refusing to be carried when walking, would honor the growl he had offered the world. Titan hopped once, testing a front paw, then set it down again and kept pace. Ethan put him into the cab and shut the door with restraint so the sound would not spook the line at the trees. The wolves held the edge like a drawn bow. They stood inside their discipline and let the men depart with the animals the world had set in motion between them. The alpha's eyes tracked the last closing door. The gray female looked past it to the stump, the tray, the dark stain on metal that was colder than blood should ever be. Her muzzle wrinkled in a quiet lupine disgust that belonged to neither morality nor myth, only to the clear comprehension of wrong pattern. "Mount up," Ethan said, sliding into the driver's seat. He kept his voice even breath measured. His fingers felt steady on the wheel. Through the side mirror, he watched the pack remain and the clearing exhale. Marcus climbed in with one last glance at the timber where Walter Pike had disappeared. "He'll circle," Marcus said. "Men like that don't learn the first time." "We'll teach him," Noah answered, buckling in eyes, never leaving the wolves. "After we get them warm." Ethan turned the key. The engine took a breath, coughed once like an old smoker, then settled into its low winter hum. Headlights found their beam again and laid a careful path across snow. The Humvee rolled forward slow, respectful, like a guest leaving an austere church. The wolves did not chase. They watched. When the vehicle reached the narrow throat of trees and began its descent toward the spur, the alpha turned his head and sent one long note into the clearing. It was not a threat. It sounded like a ledger closed without profit or loss. The pack melted back into the black architecture of the forest. Behind thick glass, 3 young shepherds breathed steam. Scout's tremors unwound into small shivers and then into a tight curl of sleep that looked like a question mark, finally finding its sentence. Nova rested her chin on Noah's boot and stared at the floor mat, as if reading the story written by salt and mud there. Titan eyes, still fever bright, lay pressed against Ethan's seat, his body half ready to leap back into a world that required his small courage. Ethan drove one-handed for a stretch and let the other settle over the console where Titan could reach it. The dog placed his muzzle into that hand as if it were the most obvious thing in winter. Marcus turned halfway around and checked pupils' gums, the neat pink of a mouth that had endured rope and still knew how to relax. Noah watched the rear window for the last hint of eyes. He saw only snow collecting in the wake, erasing their passage the way weather forgives tracks. They had them. They were alive. Yet the air in the Humvee held the weight of a story unresolved. Ropes waited somewhere out beyond the spur. A cabin held the smell of old blood and men who had turned hunger into sport. A name, Walter Pike, lived in the trees like a stubborn echo. The wolves had yielded the clearing. They had not blessed it. As the road widened, and the first faint suggestion of base radio reached for them again. Ethan breathed a single word no one else heard, a promise to a memory, and to the life pressed warm against his elbow. Home. Outside, the forest closed its dark doors and prepared its next chapter. The danger had loosened its grip on the clearing. It had not finished speaking. The Humvee's tires chewed through the last bend of the Ranger spur, its headlights bouncing off the low wall of snow piled along the track. Beyond the pines, the faint outline of the old patrol cabin appeared, its roof hunched under a quilt of white chimney smoke curling thin and slow into the cold night air. Inside, there would be a wood stove, blankets, and enough quiet to take a real breath. Outside, the cold was still a living thing, pressing its teeth into anything that dared to pause. Ethan slowed to a crawl, easing the vehicle into the small clearing where the snow had been trampled by months of winter comings and goings. He cut the engine. Silence fell like a soft but heavy door closing. The dogs shifted in the back, small shapes wrapped in the thin warmth of blankets hastily thrown over them. Their breath made little clouds in the dim light. "Let's get them inside," Ethan said, his voice low but threaded with urgency. He stepped out, boots biting into the packed snow, and opened the rear door. Titan was there, still alert, despite the exhaustion in every line of his body. The sable pup's eyes locked on Ethan's, as if memorizing him in the dark. Ethan slid his arms under the young shepherd, lifting him close, feeling the taut tremor of muscle beneath the fur. Marcus followed suit, gathering Scout into his arms with a gentleness that looked out of place in someone with his square shoulders and military gait. Scout gave a small whine, and then pressed his face into Marcus's jacket, as though finding the exact spot where warmth lived. Noah lifted Nova last, tucking the red-toned shepherd under his chin. She didn't squirm. Her tail twitched once, then stilled. Her body leaned into his as if she'd decided, at least for now, that being carried was acceptable. The cabin door protested on its hinges before giving way to a wash of warm air, scented with pine resin and old wool. The stove in the corner still glowed faintly from an earlier fire. Ethan nudged the door closed behind them, shutting out the white hush of the forest. The wind stayed outside. The cold would have to wait its turn. "Over here," Ethan said, lowering Titan onto a folded quilt near the stove. The pup settled reluctantly, ears twitching toward every creak in the rafters. Ethan dropped to one knee, pulling off his gloves with his teeth, and ran a hand lightly along Titan's chest. The rope burn was angry and raw, a deep red line cutting through the thick sable fur. He reached for the emergency kit they kept by the stove, gauze, antiseptic scissors dulled at the tips to avoid accidental cuts. As he worked, the rhythm of his breath slowed, but the memory it carried quickened. Arrow had lain like this once too, still too warm in the wrong places, blood pooling under his flank in a Syrian alleyway. Ethan remembered the frantic pressure of his own hands, the shouted calls for medics that the air swallowed without answer. He had whispered Arrow's name until his voice went hoarse, telling him he was the best boy, telling him they would go home. But Arrow's eyes had drifted away before the rotors ever found the sky. Titan flinched slightly at the antiseptic's sting. Ethan's focus tightened. "Not you," he murmured under his breath, the words more a command to the world than to the dog. "You're staying." Across the room, Marcus had settled into a battered armchair with Scout stretched across his lap. He pulled a clean towel around the pup's shivering frame, pressing him gently into the curve of his legs. Scout's breathing was uneven. His paws twitched as if still trying to run from whatever had hung above him in the clearing. Marcus opened the medkit's smaller pouch, pulling out a roll of vet wrap and a small tube of antibiotic ointment. The shallow cuts along Scout's belly were the kind that hurt more than they crippled. But Marcus treated them with the same care he'd have given a bullet graze. He worked slowly, steady hands moving with a precision learned in storms and floodwaters. When animals had trusted him with their lives, simply because he'd shown up. Pepper had been one of those animals thin-soaked, barely clinging to a half-submerged porch after a hurricane tore through Georgia. She'd followed him home after the rescue, never questioning that she belonged there. For 3 years, her paws had pattered across the apartment floor like punctuation marks in the long sentences of his life. Then one rainy night, while Marcus was away on deployment, a drunk driver had ended her story without warning. He'd stopped speaking about her after that, but his hand steady and sure over Scout now still carried the memory. "You're going to be all right," Marcus told the small shepherd quietly. Scout's eyes blinked up at him, glassy but curious, as if weighing the promise. Noah had taken the far corner where a worn rug softened the floor. Nova lay on her side in front of him, her reddish coat catching the flicker from the stove. He ran his fingers gently along her front paw where the joint was swollen and tender to the touch. She watched him with unblinking patience ears, tilting at the sound of the bandage wrapper crinkling. "Might be a sprain," Noah muttered mostly to himself. "We'll keep it wrapped, keep you off it for a few days." He wrapped the paw with practiced ease, his fingers remembering the training he'd once thought would be his life. Before the Marines, he had worked part-time at a veterinary clinic run by a retired Navy corpsman. The man had taught him that listening was more than hearing a heartbeat. It was watching the tails set the flick of an ear, the pause between breaths. Noah had applied to veterinary school twice, both times, setting the acceptance letters aside when duty called louder. Tonight, under the cabin's dim light, he felt the old quiet satisfaction of work that mended more than it broke. The room filled with the small domestic noises of care, the rip of gauze from its roll, the soft clink of scissors set on wood, the low murmur of voices meant to soothe rather than command. Outside, the forest kept its own counsel, but the wind's earlier insistence had faded to a hum against the cabin walls. Titan eased down onto his quilt, the bandage lying neat and white across his chest. He watched Ethan without moving eyes, following each shift of his rescuer's posture. Scout had stopped trembling and now rested his chin on Marcus's knee, eyes half-lidded, the set of his body less defensive. Nova tested the wrap around her paw by shifting it once, then lay her head across her forelegs, sighing softly through her nose. "You think they had anyone before him?" Marcus asked into the quiet. Ethan shook his head. "If they did, it wasn't anyone worth remembering." Noah leaned back on his heels. "Then I guess we're it." The 3 men exchanged a look, brief, unadorned, but carrying more weight than the 4 walls around them could hold. In that glance lived the unspoken truth these dogs had stepped into their lives as survivors, not strays, and survival deserved more than luck. It deserved protection. Ethan tossed another log into the stove, the flames taking it with a low whoosh. Warmth pushed deeper into the room, drawing out the smell of burning pine. "We keep them here tonight," he said. "Let them rest. Tomorrow we figure out the rest." "Figure out," Marcus repeated, a wry edge to his voice. "That's Marine speak for, we're not letting them go." Not to him, Noah said, no humor in his tone. Not to anyone like him. The dog seemed to understand in the way dogs do reading tone, reading the set of shoulders, the softening of a jawline. Titan shifted closer to Ethan's boot until the leather touched his fur. Scout rolled onto his side belly, exposed toward the stove's heat, a gesture of trust so tentative Marcus stilled his own breathing to honor it. Nova closed her eyes completely for the first time since the ropes had lifted her from the snow. The cabin's atmosphere thickened with a quiet that wasn't emptiness, but presence. 6 lives each with their own fractures, sharing the same small circle of light against the cold. The old patrol maps on the wall, the shelf of emergency rations, the radio asleep on its table. Everything seemed to fade behind the simple immediacy of warmth and breath. Ethan reached down and brushed his hand along Titan's neck, feeling the steady thump of the young dog's pulse. Marcus's palm rested over Scout's rib cage, tracking the rhythm of each inhalation. Noah laid a hand lightly on Nova's shoulder, the heat from the stove mingling with the faint warmth under her coat. They had all seen too much taken away. Tonight they'd taken something back. Whatever comes, Ethan said, not raising his voice above the stove's murmur. We keep them safe. Marcus nodded. By any means. Noah's gaze swept from Titan to Scout to Nova. Then it settled. The wood popped softly in the stove, a small sharp note in the lull. Outside, the snow continued to fall silent and steady, covering tracks burying rope fibers, dimming the scent of blood. Inside, trust began its slow work, quiet, tentative, but growing like a flame coaxed from embers. By the time the men unrolled their own bedrolls on the floor, the three pups had arranged themselves in a loose triangle near the stove, tails curled, chests rising and falling in unison. Titan kept one eye half open for a while, as if standing a watch only he understood, before surrendering to sleep. Scout's paws twitched in dreams that for now held no wolves. Nova slept deeply, her bandaged paw stretched toward the glow. The cabin held them all, a small island of warmth in a frozen wilderness, and the men, without needing to say it again, knew the choice was made. Whatever waited beyond the door, man-wolf or the winter itself, they would meet it together. And they would not lose these dogs. Not now. Not ever. Morning arrived cautiously, as if the night still owned a portion of the light and would not surrender it easily. The frost on the cabin windows patterned itself into fern-like veins. Breath fogged the glass from the inside each time someone passed. The stove was down to a lazy glow. The last log settled into a bed of coals that whispered heat rather than declared it. Outside, the storm had finished its sentence and left a clean page, an unbroken crust of snow that reflected the dull silver of a shy sun. Ethan woke first. He lay for a moment on his side, one arm crooked under his head, listening. Wind rested. The roof creaked a single timber note and was done. 3 separate dog breaths mingled near the stove. Titan's deeper rhythm, Scout's smaller flutter, Nova's long, even exhales. The cabin had changed in the small hours from a shelter into a promise. He rose without rattling the pans. Marcus was already awake behind him, the quiet sort of waking that didn't need to announce itself. He sat on the edge of his bedroll, rubbing the stiffness from his thigh, watching Scout watch him. Noah rolled onto his back and blinked at the rafters, one hand lifting to rub the heel of his palm over his eyes, then lowering to find Nova's head and give it a gentle scratch. Morning, Ethan said, voice pitched low. Morning, Marcus answered. Is it? Noah murmured, and then he smiled. Yeah, it is. They moved through the routine that made order out of cold, a kettle on the stove, coffee like motor oil coaxed from a dented press, a skillet hissing at the edges with bacon and handfuls of eggs beaten with salt. Salt and nothing else. Titan stood, as Ethan stood, his bandage snug in clean stiffness in his first step, but resolve in the second. Scout waited until Marcus said his name before unfolding himself, and then wagged once, startled at his own capacity for joy. Nova followed Noah's lead, rising delicately, testing her wrapped paw, deciding it would do. They ate, and the dogs ate, and the world resumed its size. Plan, Ethan said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. We grid from the clearing to the lower ridge. Yesterday gave us tracks. Last night gave us a mold. We read it before the sun warms it. 2 teams, Marcus asked. 3, Ethan said, and he glanced down. Titan with me. Scout with me, Marcus added, a smile, flicking his mouth at the edge. Noah stroked Nova's ear. We'll sweep right and stay on the shallow side of the draw. Keep the radiolite check-in on 10-minute marks. Ethan nodded. We document, no heroics. If this leads where I think it leads, we'll need more than bad temper and a sidearm. Shame, Marcus said dryly. Those are my best 2 things. They layered up in the accordion choreography of winter thermal wool shell until their movements sounded muffled, insulated. Ethan cracked the door. The air that flowed in was honest and hard, the kind that lit a small flame in the lungs and dared it not to go out. Titan moved to the threshold and paused head high, scenting. He stepped forward only when Ethan did, matching his pace, shoulder near thigh. The clearing where they had cut the ropes looked both familiar and different in daylight. The night had taken the worst of the story. Morning revealed what remained. The 3 branches bore raw scuffs where the fiber had sawn and bit. The stump with its rusted tray wore a wide halo of trampled snow, now frozen into shallow ripples. Around the perimeter, the delicate script of wolf pads came and went, a chorus of punctuation marks from a language that always says precisely enough and no more. "Vehicle came in low," Noah said, crouching near the old track that skirted the western trees. He brushed the powder away with a gloved hand and revealed the tread, deep, blocky, caked with old dirt that had frozen into the pattern like brown sugar. Mud in the ridges. Not from here. Up valley, Marcus guessed. Or the other side of the ridge road. He's not stupid enough to drive straight in from town. Ethan scanned the tree line with eyes that had learned the long view. Wheelbase, wide, older tires. Looks like the driver favors the right wear patterns heavier there. Noah angled his head and inhaled a habit as natural to him as reading. Gasahol. Cheap, and a bit of creosote old wood smoke. Cabin stove. "So he's living out here," Marcus said. "Or hiding out here," Ethan replied. "Either way, we let him show us." They set off, following the tire track south, where it mated with the weak suggestion of a path. Titan took to the left side of the line, nose low, tail set at a level that made Ethan think of temper held in a calm hand. Scout pranced the right side, darting ahead, and then doubling back to check the group, to check Marcus, to check the universe was still where he left it. Nova favored the inside shoulder of the trail, eyes flicking up often to Noah, as if taking cues from his breath. The snow did them the favor of simplicity. The track wound through stands of black spruce across a narrow frozen seep that complained under boots and then held, and then up into a swale where wind had laid down a soft drift. Beyond, another clearing opened, smaller, meaner, somehow the trees standing too close together, as if watching. "There," Marcus said, pointing with his chin. A shape resolved out of the background, dark. Low, the squint of a structure that was trying to be forgotten. A shack, if the word could be applied to something that looked more like a collapsed idea of shelter. Tarps patched portions of the roof. Planks warped inward as if the walls had been told to be ashamed of their angles. A stovepipe poked through one corner and leaned away from responsibility. No footprints crossed the immediate snow, but the door was shut in a way that suggested it had been shut with intent. Off to the right, a smaller geometry claimed attention. A kennel. Chain-link panels freckled with rust, a gate hanging by one hinge like a sore shoulder. A plywood roof sheet warped into an unhelpful curve, matted straw underneath turned to frozen felt. The space inside had the lonely look of something that had held life poorly, and then lost even that. Noah walked to the kennel first, Nova at his side. He didn't open the gate yet. He stood and looked as if looking were a verb that could change what it saw. "Broken latch," he said. "And look, the tie ring is bent upward, not down. Means something pulled from below for a long time." Marcus crouched by the fence. He touched the metal lightly with 2 fingers and brought them away, rubbing his thumb over them. Rust. But beneath it, the faint brown smear that is never only dirt. His mouth went flat. "Blood," he said. Inside the kennel, the straw carried pockets of darker shade, the kind of stain that only grows when time is allowed to sit. A plastic bowl lay overturned and cracked. The gnaw marks on its rim spoke of boredom and thirst more than hunger. An old length of rope was knotted through a corner, the fibers frayed into whiskers, the loop at the end polished by years of struggle. Noah eased the gate open, careful not to make the hinge complain, and stepped into the small space. The air inside had that dead sweetness old barns get when water and time and biology agree on a scent. He knelt and lifted the rope. The loop end fit his wrist a little too easily. "Slip," he said. Human slip, not an anchor hitch. Quick to put on, quick to pull tight. Nova stood at the threshold and didn't cross it. Her nose worked the air the way a musician tests a key, and then she turned her head away and blinked slow. Noah put the rope down and stood beside her, grateful for her refusal. There are places not even the brave need to step. Ethan had moved to the shack's door. He didn't touch it yet. He pressed his palm against the wood near the latch to feel for any small current of warmth that might indicate a recent fire. Nothing. He flexed his fingers and then pushed. The door opened with a groan like a tired animal. The room beyond was not large, and the winter had eaten most of its scent. But what remained caught in the throat, urine old blood that had oxidized into something copper and sweet damp wood, and the stale tang of men who don't wash their hands after cruel work. He entered first. Marcus followed, and Noah came last after one more long look at the kennel. Their boots touched down in the patterns that suggested caution outside the obvious path, stepping where the boards seemed least likely to telegraph noise. Titan came 2 paces in and stopped. Scout pressed closer to Marcus, the fur along his spine lifting and settling, lifting and settling. Nova remained in the doorway with one forepaw inside a foot in 2 worlds. Light arrived indirectly through a hole in the roof patched with translucence. Dust motes turned slow in that pool like blind fish specks of ash probably, and sloughed wood the cabin's own skin. Shelves lined one wall. A careful catalog of wrong tools, jars holding nails, and rag-wrapped metal shapes. Old blades with handles darkened by the oils of hands that should never have held them. A table bore proof of divided intention, one corner stacked with food tins, and a chipped enamel mug, the other scabbed with hide scrapes and coil marks. Cabinet, Marcus said, indicating a steel locker shoved into a corner. Its door didn't close anymore. It leaned at an angle as if unaware of its own geometry. Ethan pulled it open. A bitter waft came at him and then subsided. He saw the usual detritus of a place like this, a torn parka, a flashlight with corrosion bluing the battery heads, a coil of wire, a box of 22 shells, 2 rodent traps. And on the floor of the cabinet, coiled like a sleeping thing, a length of hemp rope stained a dozen shades from pale tea to near black. He didn't touch it at first. He looked. He measured. The fibers were thick, cheap, the weave loose enough to leave herringbone marks in skin. A portion of the coil had stiffened into shape under something's weight. One end splayed into ragged ends where a knife had made an impatient cut. Same rope, Noah said behind him, voice gone flat. Ethan reached and pinched a clean strand between thumb and forefinger, then released it. He didn't need to lift the whole coil to understand what it had done. He had felt it with his hands the night before. He had smelled it on fur. He had cut it away from breath. Marcus moved over to the table and found a ledger, spiral-bound the paper, greasy with use. He flipped it open and found columns labeled in the hand of a man who cataloged his ruin dates, weights, sign check marks, a doodled set of tally marks that ran down a margin like prison scratches. Some entries read bait, sometimes with a letter next to them, HW. Other pages held nothing but boasts. Alpha seen 5 shadows snared 1 coyote. Marcus closed the ledger and put it back where he found it. He didn't need to bring that particular stink along. Noah had found a knife on a shelf, its handle wrapped in electrical tape, the blade paring knife, thin and honed with mean determination. He set it back quietly, as if the object might bite someone else if he startled it. He glanced down and noted a scatter of fur on the floorboards near the corner. Short guard hairs, some black, some tawny. He pinched one and rolled it between his fingers. Coarse. Shepherd. He looked at Nova. She blinked back and he let the hair drift from his glove. Photographs, Ethan said, and Noah nodded. He stepped back outside and returned with a small battered camera from his pack. He moved through the room like a forensic ghost. recording the rope coil, the table, the cabinet, the shelf, the doorway. Where a lower mark scarred the wood, the height at which a head might strike when forced through. Tracks outside are older near the walls, Marcus called from the doorway. Wind eddies here. He's used this place more than this week. Ethan stood with the rope coiled at his boots and felt a tightness begin under the breastbone. Not fury first, something before fury, a cold density that warned of it. Arrow's last breath was not here. This was a different country of pain. But grief knows its own borders, and it told him, this is a hill from which men throw living things and call it sport. He looked down at Titan. The pup had inched forward, the set of his shoulders no longer the braced square of last night's defiance, but something more adult, more considered. Titan stretched his neck and lowered his head until his nose hovered inches above the rope. His lips lifted, not in panic, not in fear, an unambiguous recognition. Easy, Ethan said out of habit, but he didn't touch the dog. This belonged to Titan. The sable shepherd's nostrils worked. Scent stacked itself in his mind, bark, sap, human hand. Old blood ironed flat by time. The ghost of fear the rope had stolen from him when it bit and lifted. Titan's growl began low, a thread of wire drawn between two fence posts and then thickened into a voice that filled the small room without needing to be loud. The sound vibrated boards. Scout answered from the doorway with a thinner harmony, then seemed to surprise himself and quieted, looking to Titan for what to do next. Nova's ears pinned, and she leaned fractionally into Noah's leg, not for fear because the growl had said a true thing, and she wanted to be near the saying of it. Ethan knelt slowly until his shoulder was level with Titan's shoulder. He let the growl pass through him. He let it strike the part of him that had shouted in an alley and been ignored by the heavens. Marcus stepped half a pace closer, hand unconsciously finding the small patch of fur at Scout's throat and smoothing it. Noah's fingers found the back of Nova's neck and rested there, warm and sure. The rope lay still. The room waited. Outside, the winter held its breath, the way it does just before sun breaks through a thin seam in cloud. The growl continued steady as a vow. There are moments on which a story turns that have no metal or fire in them, only recognition. Titan knew what this rope was. The men knew what it meant that he knew it. The cabin listened and understood in its wooden way that it had been turned from a place of harm into a place of naming. Ethan reached out and without touching the rope traced its coil in the air with his index finger. This is where it started, he said the words, a marker driven into frozen ground. Titan's growl rose a half step, then settled. He placed his paw forward, not touching the rope, but near it, as if claiming the space between what had been and what would be. Okay, Ethan said the word, exhaled into the small, cold room, like a decision finally allowed to be spoken. We have our beginning. The snow around the derelict cabin lay undisturbed, except for the deep boot prints and paw tracks they'd left behind while searching. Ethan was crouched beside the rotting wall, brushing frost from a coil of blood-stained rope, when the low growl of an approaching engine rolled through the trees. The three men froze, glancing toward the narrow trail that wound in from the west. Through the drifting veil of snow, an old pickup emerged, its headlights cutting pale tunnels through the gloom. The vehicle crunched to a stop just yards from the cabin, and the driver's door creaked open. Harvey Stroud stepped down, wrapped in a battered parka, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder when he saw the uniforms. Ethan straightened, planting himself between Harvey and the others. "We were just wondering who left this place to rot," he said, his voice measured but sharp. Harvey's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Rot's got its uses," he drawled, "and I don't see how it's any of your concern." Marcus moved closer, his gaze fixed on the man's hands. "We found the ropes. The blood. Looks a lot like what someone used on 3 pups last night." "Pups?" Harvey chuckled, the sound low and mocking. If you're chasing fairy tales about strays, you're wasting your time. Wolves get what's coming to them, and so do you if you stick your noses where they don't belong. Behind the soldiers, a sudden movement. Titan, Scout, and Nova padded into view from the tree line, their eyes locked on Harvey. Titan's hackles rose instantly, a deep, throaty growl spilling into the frozen air. Scout barked sharp and high, while Nova held herself low, teeth bared. Harvey's eyes flickered recognition, then irritation. He took a half-step back, muttering something under his breath, before abruptly turning and striding toward the cabin's door. Ethan saw the flash of intent in his movements. "He's going for a weapon," Ethan barked, lunging forward. Harvey shoved the door open, vanishing into the dark interior. The metallic scrape of a gun rack being opened rang out. Ethan hit him before he could turn the two of them crashing into a table that splintered under their combined weight. The cabin filled with the sounds of grunts, curses, and boots scuffing against warped floorboards. Harvey swung wildly, catching Ethan across the shoulder. Ethan drove forward, slamming him into the wall, one hand wrenching the rifle free and tossing it aside. Harvey fought like a man cornered, but Ethan's grip was iron. Noah rushed in, grabbing Harvey's flailing arm and twisting it behind his back. "Hold him," Ethan growled, pinning the other shoulder. Marcus appeared in the doorway, rope already in hand. Within moments, Harvey Stroud was face down on the splintered floor wrists, bound tight. His breath came in furious bursts, eyes burning with something between hatred and fear. Ethan straightened, chest heaving, the cold air seeping back into the cabin. Outside, Titan's low growl finally eased, but his gaze never left Harvey. The call for backup crackled over the radio, Ethan's voice steady as he relayed their location and situation. Minutes later, the low rumble of a military transport truck rolled through the frozen forest, its green bulk emerging from the curtain of snow. Two soldiers hopped down, their breath visible in the cold air, and quickly helped secure Harvey Stroud in the back under guard. Ethan, Marcus, and Noah coaxed Titan, Scout, and Nova toward the truck. The dogs hesitated at first, sniffing the air, still unsettled after the night's ordeal. But as soon as they reached the open tailgate, Titan nudged forward, trusting the humans who had cut them down from the trees. Scout pressed close to Marcus's leg tail, thumping hesitantly while Nova tucked herself between Noah's boots, her amber eyes fixed on him. Once aboard, the truck jolted into motion, tires crunching over ice-packed trails. Inside, the warmth of the enclosed space began to thaw both dogs and men. Titan settled with his massive head resting on Ethan's knee, letting out a long, tired sigh. Scout curled against Marcus's side nose, buried in the folds of his jacket. Nova, still nursing her injured paw, laid her chin in Noah's lap, eyes half closing as his hand moved slowly over her fur. Camp Silver Ridge rose from the snowy valley like a fortress of steel and canvas watchtowers framed against pale skies. As the truck rolled through the main gate, soldiers on duty took in the sight 3 mud-streaked dogs and their equally weathered rescuers. Captain Lila Reyes was waiting just inside the motor pool, her crisp uniform a stark contrast to the snowflakes clinging to her dark hair. Her sharp gaze swept over the scene, lingering on the ropes around Harvey's wrists before settling on the dogs. "I'd like a full report in my office," she said to Ethan. Her tone clipped, but her eyes softening as Nova let out a small whine. "And get these 3 to the veterinary wing immediately." While Harvey was led away for questioning, Ethan, Marcus, and Noah exchanged a glance. The decision was unspoken, but solid. "We're keeping them," Ethan said quietly, and both men nodded. At the admin desk, they began the paperwork for official adoption through the base's canine rehabilitation program. When asked for names, Ethan's pen paused only a moment before writing Titan. Marcus chose Scout, smiling faintly at the way the little dog seemed to observe everything. Noah, brushing a hand over Nova's head, whispered her name like a promise. The veterinary wing smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean straw. Under the bright lights, medics examined each dog in turn, checking wounds, cleaning frostbitten paws, and applying fresh bandages. Titan bore his treatment stoically. Scout licked the medic's hand mid-wrap, and Nova leaned heavily into Noah's side. By the time the last bandage was taped in place, the snow outside had begun to fall again, soft, steady, and quiet, blanketing Camp Silver Ridge in a calm that none of them had felt since the rescue began. Morning light spilled across the frozen hills surrounding Camp Silver Ridge, turning the snow into a shimmering sea of white. Inside the base, the bitter winds were kept at bay by the steady rhythm of daily routines, and now by the presence of 3 new 4-legged residents who had begun to weave themselves into those routines like they had always belonged. Titan adjusted fastest to the pace of the camp. Ethan kept him on a gentle regimen, mindful of the dog's lingering stiffness from the ordeal. Each morning, the 2 of them would head to the cleared training yard. Ethan tossed a short rope toy or encouraged Titan to trot in slow circles, praising him with a quiet, steady voice. Titan's powerful frame and amber eyes gave him an imposing presence. But around Ethan, his movements softened every ear flick and tail wag, a sign of trust being built strand by strand. Marcus, on the other hand, had turned Scout's sharp curiosity into focused work. He introduced the young dog to scent drills, starting with simple target identification, using pieces of cloth hidden under traffic cones. Scout's tail wagged in quick bursts as he worked weaving between obstacles, nose to the ground. When he found the right cone, Marcus crouched to reward him with both a treat and an approving rub between the ears. It wasn't just training, it was the start of a bond built on shared purpose. Noah had found a different path for Nova. Her gentler nature and intuitive responses made her a natural fit for therapy sessions. Under the guidance of Dr. Emily Cross, the camp's lead psychological counselor, Nova began joining small group meetings with soldiers recovering from stress and injury. Emily, a calm, clear-eyed woman with a quiet way of drawing people out, recognized the change immediately. "She doesn't just listen," Emily said softly to Noah after one session. "She understands." In those meetings, Nova would move from person to person, resting her head on a knee or leaning into a hand. Hardened Marines who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time found themselves telling quiet stories as they absently stroked her fur. By the end of the first week, the effect was unmistakable. Soldiers who once passed each other with curt nods now lingered in the rec room to toss a ball for Scout or crouched to scratch Titan's neck. Titan's steady watchfulness reassured the men on guard duty. Scout's boundless energy brought laughter into the gray hallways. Nova's gentle eyes seemed to absorb the weight from anyone who met them. Even in the mess hall, their presence changed things. Ethan noticed men sharing their bacon scraps with Titan. Marcus overheard 2 mechanics debating which one Scout liked more. And Noah watched, smiling faintly, as a group of new recruits quietly rearranged their chairs so Nova could rest in the center of the circle. For Camp Silver Ridge, the days were still filled with drills, patrols, and the constant undercurrent of discipline that military life demanded. But in the quiet spaces between the dogs had begun to stitch something warmer into the fabric of the base, something no one had realized was missing until it was suddenly there. And for Titan Scout and Nova, the cold forests and danger of Hollow Creek felt like a fading shadow, replaced by the steady pulse of belonging. Ethan sat at the small desk in his quarters, a mug of coffee cooling at his elbow, the cursor blinking on the empty proposal form. Outside, the wind howled against the metal siding of the barracks, but inside, the hum of the heater and the slow, steady breathing of Titan at his feet gave the room a sense of focus. This wasn't just paperwork, it was the start of something bigger. He titled the document Guardian Paws, a canine-assisted recovery program for military personnel, and began outlining his case. He wrote about the rescue of Titan Scout and Nova, describing their condition the night they were found and the transformation witnessed in just weeks. He included photos Titan standing proudly in the training yard beside Ethan Scout mid-leap during a scent drill with Marcus Nova leaning her head into a recovering sergeant's hands during therapy. Each image was paired with a caption that spoke to the quiet but profound changes these dogs had inspired. Ethan pulled in testimonies too. A corporal who hadn't spoken during counseling sessions in months now came twice a week because Nova was there. A mechanic who'd been on disciplinary watch for weeks had turned his record around after being given the responsibility of walking Scout in the evenings. Even Captain Lila Reyes had offered her words. In a place defined by discipline and duty, these dogs have reintroduced the idea that healing can be as quiet as a warm presence beside you. He detailed the plan, expanding beyond Titan Scout and Nova to include other rescue dogs, integrating them into daily camp life and pairing them with both therapy programs and specialized support roles. The logistics were clear: veterinary care, on-site training regimens, tailored to each dog's temperament, and partnerships with regional rescue organizations. When Ethan submitted the proposal, the response from command came faster than he expected. Approval was granted not just for a trial phase, but for a full integration into the camp's rehabilitation and morale-building initiatives. Within 2 weeks, the first new dogs arrived. There was Ranger, a steady-eyed German shepherd with a scar down his flank, who had a calming effect on even the most restless recruits. Maple, a golden-coated Labrador mix, whose joy was so infectious she could coax a smile out of anyone within seconds. And Ash, a wiry, quick-footed collie who thrived in agility drills and made an instant connection with the base's physical therapy team. The atmosphere at Camp Silver Ridge shifted again. The mess hall now echoed with more than just the clatter of trays. There were sudden bursts of laughter as a dog nosed its way under a table or dropped a tennis ball at someone's boots. Therapy sessions grew in attendance, and soldiers returning from long patrols made detours to the canine wing before even visiting their own quarters. Late one night, after the final set of intake forms was signed and the last logistics email sent, Ethan leaned back in his chair. Titan stirred, lifting his head to rest it heavily on Ethan's knee. The amber eyes looked up at him, unblinking, steady, as if to say, "This is just the beginning." Ethan smiled, running a hand over the thick fur at Titan's neck. The folder labeled Guardian Paws. Active sat completed on the desk, Sorfijas, ready for its first annual review. Outside, the wind still swept across the snowy ridges. But in here there was warmth and the quiet certainty that this program was going to change lives. The morning air over Camp Silver Ridge was crisp, the kind that made each breath visible, and carried the scent of pine from the ridges beyond. A small stage had been set up in the training yard, draped with the blue and gold banner of the base, and beneath it, in bold white letters, the name of the program, Guardian Paws. Rows of folding chairs stretched out before it, already filling with soldiers, their families, and a scattering of reporters, with cameras slung over their shoulders. Ethan stood at the edge of the stage, straightening his uniform and glancing over the crowd. He could see Captain Lila Reyes near the front, arms crossed, but smiling. Emily Cross, in a dark coat, chatting quietly with Marcus and Noah. And further back, a group of veterans from the local community, men and women, whose eyes carried both the weight of service and the quiet resilience that came after. When Ethan stepped to the microphone, the hum of conversation stilled. He began with the night they had found Titan Scout and Nova, describing the snow-laden forest, the distant howl of wolves, and the sight that had made his chest tighten with urgency, 3 young dogs hanging from ropes in the bitter wind. His voice caught briefly, but he pressed on, telling how they had brought the dogs back to the cabin, how warmth and trust had been rebuilt one small gesture at a time. "These dogs," he said, scanning the crowd, "came to us from a place of cruelty and danger. They could have been lost to it. Instead, they have become something we didn't even know we were missing, a reminder that healing is possible and that loyalty runs both ways." As if on cue, Titan Scout and Nova trotted up the short ramp onto the stage, each wearing a simple harness with their name embroidered in bright stitching. Titan moved with steady confidence, Scout with bounding enthusiasm. Nova with gentle, measured steps. The audience reacted instantly, smiles, a ripple of laughter, and the flash of cameras. Ethan stepped aside as a line of veterans was invited up to meet the dogs. Titan stopped before a man with a cane, leaning his head forward until it rested against the veteran's chest. Scout pressed his body into the knees of an older woman in a wheelchair, tail wagging so hard it shook his whole frame. Nova sat before a man whose hands trembled, lifting one paw delicately into his palm and holding it there. Something shifted in the air, an unspoken understanding passing through the crowd. Shoulders eased, faces softened. For some, the emotion rose too fast to hide. A sergeant in the front row wiped at his eyes. A young recruit reached over to squeeze the hand of the man beside him. Even the reporters tasked with documenting, rather than feeling, lowered their cameras for a moment just to watch. By the time the ceremony drew to a close, the winter sun was slanting low across the yard, casting the stage in gold light. Ethan returned to the microphone one last time, glancing down at the 3 dogs sitting patiently at his feet. "They were once victims," he said quietly. "But now, they are symbols of resilience, of second chances, and of hope. Guardian Paws exists because of them, and for everyone who needs what they bring." The applause rose, not loud or raucous, but deep and sustained, carrying with it the warmth of 100 unspoken stories. Titan, Scout, and Nova stood together in the glow of the fading day, no longer just survivors, but living emblems of the promise that no one man or dog was beyond saving. The days at Camp Silver Ridge began to follow a new rhythm, one that blended the disciplined cadence of military life with the gentle, grounding presence of dogs who had once known fear. Every morning, the Guardian Paws yard came alive with motion boots crunching on gravel leashes, clipping onto harnesses, and the low, eager whines of Titan, Scout, and Nova as they waited for their partners. Titan worked most often with Sergeant Miller, a quiet man whose service in Afghanistan had left him withdrawn. At first, their sessions were silent walks along the perimeter, Titan moving at Miller's side without pulling. Gradually, the silences began to break, first with a simple, "Good boy," then short sentences, until one day laughter slipped out when Titan bounded after a tossed ball and returned with a stick instead. Scout's boundless energy found the perfect outlet in Corporal Diaz, whose physical injuries had made exercise a challenge. With Scout's playful persistence, Diaz began walking farther each week. One morning, as Scout tugged him toward the training field, Diaz realized he was no longer counting steps or watching the clock. He was simply enjoying the movement. Nova's calm presence became a balm for Lieutenant Harper, who had been plagued by restless nights and sharp edges of anxiety. Sitting with Nova in the therapy room, Harper learned to breathe with her slow inhales, steady exhales, until the tightness in his chest eased. The first time Nova rested her head in his lap, Harper closed his eyes and let the quiet settle over him like a blanket. By late March, winter began to loosen its grip. The snowbanks along the barracks shrank into patches of slush, revealing dark soil and the first shoots of green. Pine branches once weighed down with ice swayed freely in the warmer breeze. Small bursts of color appeared near the mess hall, where someone had planted early blooming flowers. Tiny purple crocuses and yellow daffodils that seemed to defy the months of gray. The Guardian Paws field took on new life. Soldiers trained side by side with their canine partners under a sky that no longer held the heavy threat of snow. Laughter rang out more often. Conversations lingered after drills. Even those who had been hesitant to join in found themselves drawn to the easy joy the dogs carried with them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges and painted the horizon in streaks of rose and gold, Ethan, Marcus, and Noah gathered outside the cabin that had become their unofficial headquarters. A small fire crackled in the stone pit, sending the smell of wood smoke into the cool air. Titan lay stretched beside Ethan, his head resting on the soldier's boot. Scout dozed at Marcus's feet, one paw twitching in a dream. Nova leaned against Noah's leg, blinking slowly, as if savoring the warmth. They didn't speak much, and they didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the pop of the fire and the occasional shift of the dogs settling deeper into their spots. Around them the camp was quiet, save for the faint hum of evening routines in the distance. From the biting cold and shadowed forests of winter to this place of light and warmth, both men and dogs had traveled a long road. They had found shelter not only in walls and roofs, but in each other, building something that felt like home, with purpose woven into its very foundation. As the firelight flickered across their faces, Ethan glanced at his friends, then down at Titan, Scout, and Nova. In their steady presence, he saw proof of what second chances could do, not just to save lives, but to transform them. Here, under the open Montana sky, they were no longer defined by what they had endured, but by the bonds they had built.